important topic this morning. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to connect with all of y'all. As you know, I've been with the organization since 2016. I'm seeing some familiar faces and names out there. So welcome. So the Benefits Navigation Program is a program that was developed, quite honestly, this is my baby. This is a program that's near and dear to my heart because I'm also a mom. I have a 30-year-old with autism, and it's navigating this whole process is challenging. And I can remember keenly what it felt like when he was aging out of the school system and we needed to have a waiver to be able to have the level of supports that he needed. So I've lived this journey and continue to live this journey alongside you. But I'm happy to be here today to talk about certainly the programs at BDI, but most in particular this morning talking about understanding Medicaid waivers. So what we're going to do today is try to do as much of a deep dive as possible in understanding what the different Medicaid waivers are. A lot of times we focus in on the now comp waiver, and we are going to spend the bulk of our time talking specifically about that process. But there are other waivers as well. So we want to talk about the different types of waivers, what the different eligibility requirements may be. As one of the things that we want to always look at is like, where are you in that point of time? What services are appropriate for you? So it may be that we have an individual who is 16 years old and probably too young to be awarded a now comp waiver, but maybe they have behavioral needs that make it appropriate for them to have behavioral supports through a gap waiver. So we're going to talk about different types of waivers, what those eligibility requirements look like, what services roll up under each waiver program, and what do those look like. And then we're going to do a nice drill down specifically into now comp, because I want you to be very clear about what that application process looks like and kind of how the flow through works, because it gets a little complicated with everything that happens at the application level. Then you get on the planning list. What are the interactions like with the planning list navigator? What's the difference between a planning list navigator and a planning list administrator, and what does that process look like? So we're going to go into all of those dynamics today. So what is a waiver? What are we waiving? What we're waiving is having services in an institutional setting. I think that's pretty much every family's nightmare. Like, what happens to us when we're gone? Who's going to take care of our kids? And we're absolutely terrified at the idea that they're going to end up in some kind of institutional setting, right? What a Medicaid waiver is it's basically saying, your level of need, the level of support needs that you have meet the criteria for an institutional level of care, specifically a level 2 criteria where you need supports with some activities of daily living. You need maybe some more minor behavioral health issues there. So you meet that level of care consistent with an intermediate care facility, but we don't want to receive services in an institutional setting. We want to receive those services in a home and community-based setting. So that's what we're waiving. We have that eligibility, so we show that we're eligible and we meet that level of care criteria, but we elect to waive services in an institutional setting in favor of a home and community-based setting. That's a waiver. So what kinds of waivers are there? We have a number of different types. And again, life doesn't happen in isolation. It's like you don't just start at age 22, right? You go through as a young child getting the diagnosis, and then children and adolescents, and then going through that life cycle where the different waiver programs to some degree reflect those changes in the life cycle. So the Georgia Pediatric Program, GAP, is a very interesting program because it used to only hone in on skilled nursing, like individuals that are medically fragile, that are going to require literally 24/7 care because they require positioning and having trach suctioning and all that. But GAP has expanded to include behavioral issues, individuals with autism who have behavioral challenges. So you might be eligible for that program, even as you're also simultaneously eligible for Now Comp. Well, the Now Comp, again, this is a waiver program that is geared primarily for, well, specifically for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, primarily geared for individuals after they've aged out of the school system, because we're really talking about day programs, group homes, host homes, services in the home, that sort of thing. So what do you do for children? Well, that's why you have GAP that could then age into Now Comp, or GAP with let's say if you have GAP with an emphasis on skilled nursing needs, that could age into community care service. So again, there's skilled nursing that's associated with some elements of the community care service program. So it's really important that you have awareness of these different programs so you can kind of figure out, okay, I'm eligible for Now Comp, really long planning list. Could I use any of these other programs in the interim? Am I eligible for any of these programs? Do these programs meet my needs? GAP is going to be specifically for children and adolescents. You're going to age out of that at 21. Community care, primarily skilled nursing, but there are some respite type group homes available. And sometimes I see some flexibility with community care service into the realms of general behavioral health and mental health. Elderly and disabled waiver, when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking the program within that is called SOURCE. I'm sure many of y'all have heard of SOURCE. This is primarily a home health type program. So if you're looking for services that are more community based, the elderly and disabled waivers not going to be your best shot. But if you're needing some extra supports in that home setting, like somebody coming into the home to do meal preparation and to help with some personal self-care, the elderly and disabled waiver might be the right fit for you. The independent care waiver program is probably the one that has the most similarities to Now Comp. A lot of the services are very much the same. If you're self-directing Now Comp with your community living supports, meaning that you have a care provider that's coming into the home to provide those services, that service cap is the same under Now Comp as it is with independent care waiver. I have a lot of folks who are in an independent care waiver and think, oh, I should probably move over to Now Comp. And I'm like, but you're self-directing. It's the same amount of money. There's no real great incentive to move over unless you're looking to add other services. The independent care waiver program, individuals with traumatic brain injuries, that's sort of an asterisk for them, that they're specifically wanting to reach out to individuals with traumatic brain injuries, as well as individuals who have physical limitations but not cognitive limitations. So someone who is going to need that personal assistant to be able to transfer from the bed into a wheelchair and so forth. And then of course there's Now Comp, which is, people are like, what's the difference between the Now Comp? So what the real essential difference is the level of services that you're receiving under the waiver. It's the same application process. It's the same global level of services. It's just if you have one or two services, it's a new options waiver. If you have two or more services, you're starting to receive a higher level, a more comprehensive level of services, hence the comprehensive waiver. But this is just a snapshot of the different types of waiver programs. I know a lot of times we come in going, we need Now Comp, but it's always appropriate to take a step back and go, are any of these other programs appropriate for us at this time? That would be a good place for us to receive a higher level of service while we're pending that Now Comp waiver. So let's delve into Now Comp. So when we're thinking about the Now Comp waiver, all of these programs are managed through the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, lovingly called the DBHDD. You know, we love our acronyms. Now Comp is earmarked specifically for individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. There's a lot of folks on the planning list, and historically there have always been a heck of a lot of people on Georgia's planning list, and it's quite frankly due to Georgia's history. You know, Georgia for many years was the kingpin of institutionalization. You know, 100 years ago, everybody on the Eastern Seaboard sent their loved ones with disabilities to Milledgeville. I mean, that's what Georgia did. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago with the Olmstead decision that it became much more the societal norm that individuals were not sent away to institutions, rather that they should be receiving services in their homes in the community. And so that Olmstead decision really brought in the importance of programs like a Now Comp waiver, but Georgia was kind of behind the 8 ball with that, so we've been a little slow in being able to get waivers awarded to folks. We've seen a big push. The past 2 years have been pretty amazing. We had 513 awards in fiscal year 2023. We're halfway through fiscal year 2024. There were another 500 waivers that were budgeted. So we are definitely seeing movement on that planning list. I know BDI has assisted with at least 20 awards since July. So I'm seeing them happen. That's awesome. The challenge is helping you understand how to demonstrate that your case is most in need. And so the trend that I'm seeing, which has always been, is individuals who are still school age. When I say school age, I'm thinking all the way through IDEA, all the way up to age 22. Okay, so anybody who's 21 and younger, the DBHDD is still kind of pointing fingers to the Department of Education, going, yeah, y'all should be the ones providing the primary level of resources and supports to the individual because they're school age. But when the individuals hit 22, all the fingers pointing back to the DBHDD. So you're going to have a lot more leverage with your strategy or your advocacy strategy to be awarded a waiver when your loved one is 22 or older. And then it's simply understanding what are those planning considerations and how do you connect with your planning list navigator in a way for them to understand what that level of need is. So awards are based on most in need, which makes it a little awkward feeling. It's like you know, in other states, I mean, Georgia's a little out there. Other states, you just move seamlessly into services, but in Georgia, kind of puts you in a competitive stance with other individuals that you bear the burden of proof of showing that your loved one requires these in order to maintain stability, in order to maintain their safety. They're going to need this level of service. So it kind of feels like it pits families versus families. But I think if we instead reframe that as just like, let's do a real needs-based assessment of what your loved one needs, and let's hone in on that and demonstrate how having these services would meet that need. That's a much more effective advocacy strategy to secure that waiver. What are the program goals for a waiver? It's to help the individual live independently. This is going to sound a lot like an IEP, in the least restrictive setting possible. In other words, we are waiving that institution setting. We don't want our loved ones to be in an institutional setting. We want them to be in a home setting. We want them to have community access, community inclusion, to be able to live purposeful lives. We want everybody to live the good life. And in order to do that, they're going to need a higher level of supports than their neurotypical peers in order to be a part of the community in that way. So what's the eligibility criteria for the now comp waiver specifically. So what they're looking at is that you need to demonstrate through a psychological evaluation and other medical documentation the diagnostic criteria, which is this is a developmental disability or an intellectual disability. This is a chronic condition that occurred prior to age 22. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have that diagnosis prior to age 22, although that is very helpful, but the condition itself has to be there. And where this gets a little wonky is sometimes when I have older individuals that are presenting not with a developmental condition like autism or cerebral palsy, rather they're just presenting with an intellectual disability, and we have to prove that they had that intellectual disability prior to age 22. You know, autism, we're born that way. So if we have an autism diagnosis, even if we're not getting that diagnosis till age 30, we know that condition developed prior to age 30, right? So we do want to have as much documentation as possible showing that there were needs prior to age 22 and that there were limitations with regard to that person's ability to function and to take care of themselves. So getting down to brass tacks, if you look at the Now Comp application, the Now Comp application itself is a 2-page document. It's just simply asking, you know, what's the applicant's information? What's your information? And what's the legal status of this person? Is it a minor? Is the person competent, or has the person been legally adjudicated incompetent because you have guardianship? And then what services are you looking for? That's it. That's the extent of this 2-page application for Now Comp. But going along with that application, call it the scavenger hunt. It's a list of different types of documents, some of which are pointing to what's going to help them determine that the individual meets eligibility criteria. First and foremost is going to be that psychological evaluation. So what they want to see in that psychological evaluation is, you know, what's the diagnosis? What do we got going on here? Was there a genetic anomaly that resulted in autism or characteristics of autism and some diminished intellectual capacity? And like what happened? What's going on? What's the diagnosis? So they're looking to see that diagnosis, but also the impact of that diagnosis. So think about it both ways. It's not enough just to show, hey, my kid has autism. See this eval? He has autism. It's what's the impact? How severe is this to the degree of what supports are needed? So what they're looking at are some of those quantitative scores in the psychological evaluation to help them make that determination. So what they're looking at are those quantitative scores. What's the cognitive impact? What's that full scale IQ? And so they're looking to see if there is a cognitive impact of scores that are lower than 70. 70 is your cutoff score. And then if you have an individual whose intellectual functioning is higher than that cutoff, then what is that individual's adaptive function? What is adaptive function? Adaptive function is your ability to perform day-to-day operations, right? It's your ability to take care of yourself. It's your ability to socialize. It's your ability to communicate. It's your ability to perform self-care. That's adaptive function. So if we have somebody whose intellectual function, let's say they have a score of 82, okay? But if that adaptive function across 3 of those critical domains is below 70, then they're also going to be eligible. So what I'm seeing is a trend of them looking not only at the global adaptive composite score, but they're also looking at those individual scores. So like if you look at the psychological evaluation, you're going to have all these different domains like social, right? Let's use social as an example. So if the global adaptive composite is 68, okay, well, that's going to be below 70, right? So that looks good. But if the social is over, so let's say it's 76, you could get some pushback from the DBHDD on that, because they're going to want to see, well, sounds like he's doing pretty well in this domain, even though he needs some supports in that domain. So I strongly urge you, before you apply to the DBHDD for now comp eligibility, is screen that evaluation. Be familiar with what scores you have, because you don't want to get in a situation where you're providing documentation that you look at this and go, oh, we didn't actually meet that criteria. Because even if you got a newer evaluation that shows some of these numbers, they're going to have that original document, and that could create some pushback from the DBHDD. So I always urge you to be a little cautious as you're gathering your documentation. Make sure that before you submit that documentation to the DBHDD, that you feel confident that it's going to meet their eligibility criteria, and you're really wanting to look at those scores. Another big issue is the age of that individual when they had these scores. So it's not uncommon that I'll see an evaluation with an adolescent, let's say they're 15 or 16 years old, and I look at the actual scores and realize, whoa, they used a children's scale for this individual, and that can sometimes skew the numbers a little bit. Like if you're comparing an adult to a child, the numbers are going to be more robust, right? So be familiar with your evaluation. Don't submit an evaluation that's really old. I had someone who wanted to submit an evaluation when the individual was aged 5, but now they're 25. So there's been 20 years of growth there. So I'm like, they're going to ask you for a new evaluation, because where they were 20 years ago is not necessarily an accurate reflection of what their current level of function is. So you generally want to submit a relatively recent evaluation along with that application to demonstrate that they clearly meet this criteria. So you've gone through the application process. Page 2 again is like, what kind of services that you want? The thing about that section, I always kind of like, why do they even ask this? Because I guess it's just to kind of give them a global idea of kind of what your needs are. Because the reality is, once you submit your application, you're going to go through this whole screening and intake assessment process, the purpose of which is to kind of flush out what needs that you have. So it more or less renders moot whatever services that you may have listed on the application. And I say that just to kind of give you a little bit of take a deep breath when you're completing that application. Don't sweat this section, because you're not tied to this section. So let's say if you put, we need supports in the home, and then you're like, oh, I really needed a day program. Why didn't I put day program? It's okay. As you go through that intake and assessment process, all of the holistic, well-rounded support needs are going to come out through that process. So, it's nice to be able to be familiar with the services so you can list that on the application. But more importantly, it's important for you to be aware of the services so that as you're thinking about the long-term planning and as you're thinking about what those service needs are, that you can be better informed with that process. So what are those types of services? Every person with a waiver is going to always have support coordination and fiscal management services. That's not something that you elect. It's just something that happens. That's like an internal core service. So what that means is, and it's so different from your experiences with the IEP. You go to an IEP, doesn't it feel kind of like this us versus them? Like you're on this side of the table and there's this whole other team on the other side of the table, and it's this whole battle. Once you're awarded a waiver, it doesn't feel like that at all. You have you select a support coordinating agency. The purpose of that support coordinating agency is so that you have somebody on your team who knows the system. Yay! So that support coordinator is charged with not only helping you develop your individual support plan, but also to help you identify providers for that plan, and also to check in regularly with you to make sure that everything's going well, that there haven't been any new diagnoses, there haven't been any significant changes. So, you have support. Yay. So that's the support coordinating side. And then there's the fiscal management side. So when we talk about being awarded a waiver, if you have a comp waiver, you're getting between $60,000 and $90,000 worth of services a year. That's right. So you don't actually see that money. Okay, that money is maintained through the fiscal manager. So you select your support coordinating agency and your fiscal agent, and that fiscal agent, that's a group, like if you were self-directing your care, that's the group that you're going to submit the timesheets to. You're managing your budget. If you selected a day program with an agency, the agency isn't sending their bill to you, they're sending the bill to the fiscal manager. So you got to have the support coordinating agency and that fiscal management, that fiscal agent. Those are the first two things that you're going to do once you're awarded that waiver. Then it's a matter of, okay, we're going to develop a service plan, and what are the types of services that we're going to need. The most common service, especially with brand new waivers, is usually this community access group service. That's a day program. So community access individual, that's having a care provider take your individual out into the community to do community activities, whether it's, recreational activities or other activities. If it's one-on-one, that's community access individual. If there's more than one person being served at that time, then it's a group, right? So there's different funding levels for each. So if you were to say, oh, the day program really isn't a good fit for my guy, community access individual is a much better fit. The level of funding is not the same with these two. So the community access group, that's going to be roughly, I need to crunch the numbers, $18,000-$19,000 worth of services. Community access group is probably a little more than $10,000 to $11,000 in services. So it's you wouldn't be able to get an individual for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week that you would have under your classic day program community access group. Under community access individual, you'd probably be able to do about half that, roughly. But having that flexibility, can you have both? Can you have both community access group and community access individual? Yes, but you wouldn't have the full amount. In other words, if you had the full day program, which would be, again, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 30 hours of CAG, you would probably have a lesser amount of community access individual supports. Pre-vote support is also a service. This is usually delivered through a day program that's doing pre-vocational training. So the trend that I see with most day programs is, even though the actual activity is kind of pre-vocational oriented, they're still billing under community access group, because if you are a program and you are billing under pre-vocational support, the expectation that the DBHDD is going to have is that that person would be in pre-vocational support for maybe a year, but then they're going to go from pre-vocational support to more of an employment level. So that should switch from pre-voc to supported employment. And that doesn't always happen. So the safety net for the programs is to continue to bill under community access group, even if the individual is participating in a workshop or other pre-vocational type of support, it's still often billed under CAG. What are community living supports? So CLS, this is services in an individual's own home. If you are receiving services like in a host home environment or a group home environment, that's going to be community residential alternative which is only affiliated with the comp waiver, because it's kind of a high ticket item all by itself. But if the individual is coming to the family home to provide services, or if the individual is in their own apartment and receiving services, that's going to be CLS. So the key difference between CLS and the CRA is who owns the home. And that's really what it's going to be. So if it's the own home, then it's CLS. If it's the group home, it's always going to be CRA. Respite, a little confusing because respite is done in units. So the maximum number of units is 30. Okay, and so what that equates to is 30 days. So respite is the only service that is going to be able to be billed on a 24-hour cycle, meaning that if I'm doing an overnighter and I have a care provider with my son for 24 hours, I would always use the respite instead of using CLS for those 24 hours. Make sense? Yeah, so respite can bill up to that 24 hours, but it's done as a unit. And it's a little squirrely because, so let's say if I were using respite and I was using it for 6 hours, that's still 1 unit, even if I was using it for 24 hours. So no matter how many hours within that time, it's still going to be 1 unit. So you need to be aware of, especially if you're self-directing and you're managing your budget yourself, it's like, how does this work? How do I maximize the budget that I have and manage, to the care costs of my care provider. You need to have that familiarity for what the unit rates are for all of these services so that you can kind of balance that. But short answer, yes, I have used respite sometimes in situations where it wasn't a full 24 hours, but it was like an 8-hour or 10-hour kind of thing. But I used 1 unit of respite. Behavioral support generally includes having support with the functional assessment and development of a behavior intervention plan, and then the care and management of that plan. Having a behavioral therapist provide support along those lines. So a very, very important service. And then supported employment. So when we think about supported employment under a waiver, supported employment in this context is to maintain the job. It's not to get started with the job, it's to maintain the job. So this is where, again, you have to look at agencies globally. Okay, so you have your Department of Education. So everybody's looking at Department of Education as primary provider services until age 22. Department of Labor, okay, all things tied to work. That's going to be Georgia Vocational Rehabilitation Agency. And then the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, which is all things related to access in the community and life. So when you think life skills, you think DBHDD. When you think work skills, you think GVRA. So you're always kind of toggling back and forth between both of these agencies. So let's say I have a waiver and my loved one has been in a day program and he gets community living support. So he gets some of these other services, but now he wants to have a job. So before I add supported employment to his ISP under the waiver, I've got to go to Voc Rehab to start that process to get him ready to get the job. Okay. So that getting him ready for the job, securing that employment, and then getting him settled in the job for 90 days, that's GVRA. And then post 90 days, that's supported employment. Okay, that's that continuation. So a lot of times people think I only need DBHDD, but if you're doing any kind of interest in with work, you're toggling. Okay, so you're going to start with Voc Rehab, then when it turns into supported employment, then it becomes a service under the waiver to maintain that employment. Likewise, if you're on the planning list for now comp, and you start with voc rehab to get that job, and then you're into that maintaining point. You maintaining under the DBHDD, not through the waiver, but through another program called Competitive Integrated Employment. So the DBHDD basically has two ways to provide supported employment. If you're on the waiver, it's through the waiver, right? You start with voc rehab, you get to the point of maintenance, then it's a waiver service. If you're not on a waiver and you're still on the planning list, then the DBHDD is going to use that competitive integrated employment program in order to fund your supported employment needs. So these are the core services under the DBHDD now comp waiver. So again, the most common when you've initially awarded a waiver, usually see the community access group and a little bit of community living support and a little bit of respite. The weird thing is the hard part is getting your waiver, right? Once you've gotten the waiver, and this is going to feel a little unfair, once you've gotten a waiver, it's relatively easy to add services to that waiver. So you don't have to start off with all the moon and stars. You start off with what do you need, and then as your service needs change, you do a version change, you do an ISP addendum, and you add those services over time. So don't worry about having all of the services set up upon initial award of a waiver, knowing that as your service needs change, it goes back to having that support coordinator. You communicate those service needs change, and then that process begins to add those other services. So how do you apply? The Now Comp application, pretty straightforward. Again, it's that 2-page document that we mentioned with just your information as an applicant, the information of the person who's helping complete the application, the status, is it guardianship, a minor, or competent? And a lot of times people struggle with that because it's like, but they're not really competent. And your threshold is, but have they been adjudicated incompetent? So unless you've gone through that process to secure guardianship, they're going to be viewed as competent if they're over the age of 18. So if they're under the age of 18, they're minors. If they're 18 or older and have not been, going through that court hearing to have a guardianship, then they're going to be competent. If they've gone through that court hearing, they have guardianship, then they have guardianship. So again, that's it. It's the contact information, the individual's information, contact information, guardianship, and then that second page is the requested services. But the hard part, again, that list of required documents. There's a couple of things extra on that. You have to show like lawful presence, so they're going to ask for a copy of the birth certificate or passport or something. They're going to ask for any Social Security documentation that you have. Do you have your Medicaid card? You don't have to show your Social Security card, but you have to have Social Security number for that. And then there's a privacy form that you need to sign. That's going to be part of the application too. So what do you do? All right, so gather. You get all that supportive documentation together and you submit it to your regional DBHDD office. There's 6 regions in Georgia. We're BDI's predominantly serving region 3. So that's, Gwinnett, DeKalb, Clayton, Rockdale, Fulton counties. So when you are outside of those counties, you need to double check to see what region are you in. And so on the face of the application, they're going to have all 6 of those regional offices there, and you would send your application to the regional office for the county that you're in. So they're supposed to complete the application review in 30 days. Sometimes it takes a little longer. But what they're doing is like, okay, we've got everything in the application, check. We still need to do an intake evaluation. So pre-pandemic, that intake evaluation was the person coming out to the home. They're like, they need to lay eyes. Now it's more Zoom based, but they still want to lay eyes. They want to see, who is this person? And let's have a conversation. And it's a very cursory conversation. It's not too in-depth, but basically what they're trying to do is to confirm that this individual meets that level care, but level 2 care criteria where they would have met requirements to be in that institutional setting. Meaning level 2 basically means that this individual is going to require some supports for activities of daily living, or is going to have some minor behavioral issues. So that's really level 2. So that intake evaluation is to confirm that level 2, that this individual does indeed require supports for some of these activities of daily living. So once they've done that, they go, yep, you're eligible. Then they give you a letter. Keep that letter. That letter is very important. And basically it's that you've been predetermined eligible for an outcome waiver. Oh, unfortunately, we don't have enough funding right now. So you've been assigned to a planning list, and a planning list navigator will be in contact with you. So you get that letter, you're on the planning list, this part about planning list assignment, the planning list administrators, they don't really maintain a caseload per se. We have 3 planning list administrators serving Region 3. What they're doing is they just kind of work together to make sure that everybody's getting at least an annual assessment, and they're fielding calls to address any significant changes in that person's needs. But they don't really have a caseload per se. But generally, when I say assigned, it's like if an individual has done an assessment with, let's say, Delicia, for example, then Delicia is more or less like your go-to person. So you would maintain the contact information of that particular planning list navigator, because you really do want to build a relationship with them. Okay. So what's the planning list navigator's job? So they're going to do a determination of need assessment, try to figure out what are your service needs. And they're really doing this from 2 perspectives, okay? They're trying to figure out both what are your needs, and then are you most in need? And this is where families sometimes go sideways, because we've been trained through all of our IEPs to be very strengths based with our conversations about our kids. And they're our kids. We're proud of our kids. I want to tell you about how my son is so cute. He is so charming. He's the life of the party. He's all these wonderful things, right? I don't want to talk about his bad days. I don't want to talk about his meltdowns. But when you are working with your planning list navigator, guess what you have to talk about? You got to talk about the whole support needs on a good day, but also on a bad day, right? That's going to help them figure out who is most in need. So when you're talking to the planning list navigator, your best strategy is to talk about them. It's like, if you weren't there, like what would happen if you weren't there to manage all the ins and outs and maintain safety and maintain well-being? What would happen? That's how you get to most in need. If you are the one that's keeping this boat afloat and you take a step back and it's going to just sink, that's what the planning list navigator needs to know. That's what helps demonstrate most in need. Another thing that you'll see with the planning list navigators is they want you to be able to receive some level of service while you're on the planning list, and also to see is that going to be enough service, right? So family support services, I mean, it's a great program anyway because it's providing supports to families, but it's an essential service to show the DBHDD that, okay, we've got family support, so we're maximizing all available resources, okay? We are doing everything that we can, and here's the gap analysis. Even with all these services, this is still what we're experiencing. Again, that helps demonstrate who's most in need. So you want to do it for that reason, as well as just to ensure that you're getting some appropriate services to help. And here's the thing: is like if you are receiving family support services, and then you're like, "Yep, we're good." All right, you're not most in need then. Okay, So there may be some individuals, and this is also true, we can have individuals who are eligible for family support services who aren't eligible for a now comp waiver. So they're going to be in that program pretty much indefinitely. If you meet eligibility for a now comp waiver, then the burden shifts to you to always show what your level of need is, what your support needs are, and what that gap analysis looks like. Even though you're receiving these kinds of services, yeah, I get these services from folk rehab because we just, trying to get started with a job, and yes, we get this from family support, but here's where our need still is. That's your demonstrating most in need. So, gosh, you're the planning list navigator. Imagine, all right, you're the planning list navigator. You've got 1,000 people that you're working with. How do you know who's most in need? It's your job to screen everybody and identify those most in need cases to go to the supervisor with a recommendation of this person needs a waiver. That's the process. So you can imagine if you don't know who your planning list navigator is, then how likely is that planning list navigator going to identify your child as being most in need, right? So forming that relationship, being very candid, letting them know of all the changes that are going on, any new diagnoses, any changes in behavior, any regression, any other significant thing that's happening in the life. We had one guy, he was doing pretty well. He needed some needs, but his mom was able to take care of everything, so he was stable until mom developed breast cancer, and then house of cards tumble. So that's something that you would report. That's part of the planning list considerations. And we hear that urban bit, somebody's got to die before you get a waiver. Well, there's a little bit of truth to that, because the cold, brutal truth is if somebody were to die, then that person is at 100% most in need because their care provider isn't there anymore. So that's why you hear that myth. What they're looking at is the individual safe or not safe? Is the situation stable or not stable? Do we have any behavior? Or is that behavior under control? Is that behavior to the point where it could come to the attention of law enforcement? These are the things that the planning list navigator is looking at to go, whoa, whoa, we got to get this person some supports, because keep in mind the DBHDD wants to maintain stability, right? So if everything's hunky-dory, then it's like you're not most in need, because who's most in need is this burning house over here, right? So they're trying to do all these assessments to figure out that level of most in need, and these planning list considerations help them determine who's going to be awarded a waiver. So this is where you've got to be truthful, you've got to be candid, you've got to be in a situation where you're telling the planning list navigator, this is hard to say out loud, but this is what's going on, because it may be that what you may be keeping inside could actually be that thing that could be demonstrating that you're most in need. So, and sometimes that means like, your age, your medical conditions that are preventing you from being able to do everything that you used to be able to do. Or maybe these behavioral issues that have started to spiral a little more out of control, right? And so, calling the Georgia Crisis Access Line, that's going to be important. Calling your planning list navigator to let them know, hey, we had another meltdown last night. I called GCAL, we documented everything, but y'all, this is getting worse instead of better. I really need some help. That's the kind of advocacy that you would be doing with your planning list navigator. I'll hear people talk about, you need to call regularly, call every month, call every week. That's nagging. It's not necessarily reporting anything new or different. What you want to make sure that you're doing is that you have a good relationship with your planning list navigator and you're reporting all of these instances. Okay, so I think we might be having a few technical problems to present to move the slides. Here we go. All right. So once you've been awarded a waiver, yay, you finally get to that point where you've actually been awarded the waiver. What happens then? So it's going to take a little bit of time. Well, it's going to take a lot of time. They're backlogged, and what we're seeing now is a trend of people being awarded a waiver, but this is when you have the baton pass from the planning list navigator to the planning list administrator, who guides you in that selecting of the fiscal agent, support coordinating agency, who's going to help you get that DMA-6 to show that they meet that level of care, that you're doing assessments. There's some more assessments to do, yay. There's a health risk screening tool. There's a supports intensity scale. And then you're developing the ISP. So you're going to be working with that planning list administrator. That's like a baton pass. You get on the planning list, start with the planning list navigator, baton pass to planning list administrator, baton pass from planning list administrator to the actual support coordinator. So that's how that works. All right. So I know that y'all can't see the slides, but that's okay because we're pretty much, at the end. I did want to, to share that, once you have that waiver, once you've been awarded a waiver, it's a taking, oh gosh, it used to take about 8 to 10 months to go through the process, but now it's becoming a little longer because we're waiting to have for that assignment to a planning list administrator. So you might get the great news, hey, from your planning list navigator, you've been awarded, we've finally gotten approved, yay. But now we have to wait for a planning list administrator. So just know that process is going to take some time. So let me field some questions here. I hope this has been helpful for you. One of the questions I see, can you be in a group home and get supports for employment? Yes, absolutely. You sure can. So again, the plans are very person-centered. So you're not going to generally see plans that, people may have the same services, but their ISPs are individual support plans. So it's going to be based on what those unique needs are. What other questions do you have? You can just type them in the chat box if you have any questions. If you've fallen through the cracks and never had this info before, what do you do? Well, what we want to do is check to see what you may be eligible for. If you have a traumatic brain injury, we might want to look at independent care waiver. If you have that, the thing about the traumatic brain injury is that it is going to have to occur prior to age 22. So sometimes we have really sad cases where we have 23-year-olds who are in terrible car accidents and they have a traumatic brain injury, but they're ineligible for the independent care waiver because they were older than 22. So that one is where you see the age really stick to it. So yeah, we would want to look at eligibility criteria based on whatever medical documentation that you have. Other questions? Going on. Go and try. When is supports intensity scale assigned? So generally, you've been awarded a waiver when, and this is the weird thing, they never give you a letter that says you've got the waiver. You get the letter that says you've been determined eligible for a waiver, but not one that says you've gotten a waiver. I don't know why. But the supports intensity scale is part of that process. So usually first is a selection of the fiscal agent, support coordinating agency, DMA-6, and then they try to get that intake nurse who's going to do the health risk screening tool to do that, as well as the person doing the supports intensity scale. One can take place before the other. You can do the HRST before the CIS. There's no real rhyme or reason to that so much as it is just getting on their calendar. How early should parents apply for the waiver? I used to say, wait till you're 14, but now because you see that family support services are prioritized based on individuals who are on the planning list, I strongly recommend that you get your loved ones on the planning list as soon as possible. Do you have to have SSI or SSDI to get a waiver? No, you have to have Medicaid, but there are more than 30 classifications of Medicaid in Georgia, and each waiver program has its own classification of Medicaid. So let's assume that for whatever reason, the individual never went through the Social Security process, which is a bad idea because you want Social Security for the health insurance and for the income. But assume you didn't have it. But you need Medicaid. If you go through this process and you're awarded a waiver, then you're going to be eligible for the now comp classification of Medicaid. So that's how you would do it. Is now comp or any of these services, are they income based? No, they're not. They're based on severity and impact of the condition. What proof of eligibility for traumatic brain injury? So, you would look at what's the medical documentation, what caused the traumatic brain injury, and then what's the severity and impact for that. So generally, you're going to see both clinical medical records as well as likely a psychological evaluation to determine the impact on cognitive function. Your son has turned 18. Should we apply now? Heck yeah. I would strongly encourage you to apply. Make sure that you meet those eligibility requirements, though. Don't wait till they're out of school. Now, you don't really see that many seamless waivers. I mean, again, I would not have a job if we were in New York City because it would just go, from seamless right into services. Georgia's not like that. So we kind of have to haggle a little bit and leverage all of our resources. But yeah, go ahead and take advantage of all services. Take advantage of family support services. Make sure they're on the now comp planning list. If you're interested in work, make sure that you've gone through the intake with Voc Rehab. If the student's close to 22, the parents think they've applied for a waiver years ago, what should they do to activate their application? Call the regional office, say, hey, we applied a long time ago. It's been forever. We don't even know who our planning list navigator is. Haven't talked to anybody in years. They're going to do a little scramble, go through their system, see if they can find their application. And if they can't, then you need to do a new application. If you haven't heard from a planning list navigator in more than a year, assume your case has gone sideways. Their expectation is to do an annual assessment. So they should be in contact at least one time annually while they're on the planning list. So if it's been years since you've heard from somebody, really good chance that they're not on the planning list. How does BDI help? Do you help us apply and go through the process? We sure can. In fact, I have a assessment. I love my assessment because it helps you develop an advocacy strategy. So it takes us 2 hours to go through. At the end of it, you get like this 14-page report that itemizes everything. And I think it helps families feel more confident in how they're communicating their individual's needs. So that is definitely a service that BDI provides. Would an individual be eligible if the young adult is transitioning to Medicare? Sure, because again, there's different classifications of Medicaid. So what would happen is, let's say, and here's the other thing, if the young adult started with SSI and had Medicaid and transitioned to SSDI to Medicare, they should still be able to maintain straight Medicaid as a childhood disability beneficiary. But then depending on what kind of classification of waiver that they have, there may be that Medicaid classification for that as well. How can parents get your help? Bobby, what's the best way to do that? Is that to use the info at bobbydodd.org to send in questions? We have an application process as well. If you go to our website, bobbydodd.org website, you can apply for benefits navigation services. Any other questions? All righty. Sounds like we're good. Well, I would encourage any of you to, if you have any other questions, to send them in. Also, we're going to do this webinar again. This is usually the type of webinar you need to listen to it a couple of times, and it's recorded, so that link will go out. This is kind of complex, so you might have to listen to this a couple of times or come onto another session. Feel free to come onto all of our sessions, because we're going to build out our calendar. We have another webinar that will be coming up next quarter on Social Security, as well as working as a Social Security beneficiary. So we have a number of different webinars coming up. If you lost Medicaid, is there help to receive it again? Yeah, we are pretty good at the Medicaid reinstatement part. So, yep. It's all going to be dependent upon, why you lost the Medicaid and whatnot. So I appreciate everybody's questions and all of your time and your support of BDI. We're delighted to be able to bring this information. And Anne, I just saw your comment of being a VR counselor and clearing up a lot of misconceptions. That's great. That's exactly what we're here to do, to help shed light on a pretty complicated process and make it a little bit easier to navigate. That's why we're benefits navigators. So look forward to connecting with you again. Thank you so much. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everyone for joining us. Stay in touch with us. We will be on social media even during the holidays. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@bobbydodd.org. Bye.
Bye-bye.